Plantation logs from northeastern Alabama contain an entry dated March 1856 that still baffles anyone who reads it. 12 armed men, trained, seasoned, and acting fully within the authority of the law, failed to subdue a single individual. The incident report, hidden in county archives for more than a century, details wounds no person should have survived, a level of resistance physicians of the era claimed wasn't biologically possible, and an aftermath so unsettling that 3 overseers resigned within days. 2 of them would never again speak of what they witnessed. The owner of the estate ordered every document sealed away, paying families generous sums to ensure their silence. Whatever happened on the Radcliffe plantation, that spring morning wasn't supernatural. It was something far more terrifying, an unfiltered truth about human capability that threatened the very architecture of Southern society. Before we continue with the story of Jacob Terrell and the morning that shattered the Radcliffe estate forever, if you're drawn to grim historical mysteries that blur the borders between recorded fact and impossible legend, subscribe to this channel and let us know in the comments what state you're watching from. We love hearing where our community uncovers these forgotten American stories. The incident at Radcliffe Plantation didn't erupt from nowhere. To understand what unfolded, you must understand the man, the place, and the rigidly engineered system that both shaped him and feared him. Radcliffe Plantation stretched across nearly 3,000 acres of Alabama bottomland, where the Tallapoosa River sliced through red clay ridges thick with pine and oak. Founded in 1821 by Colonel Marston Radcliffe, a veteran of the Creek War, the estate had become one of Madison County's most profitable cotton enterprises. By 1856, it held 240 enslaved people, produced roughly 1,500 bales a year, and employed 17 white overseers, an unusually high number of locals attributed to Colonel Radcliffe's obsessive management style. The main house sat on a rise overlooking the fields, a Greek Revival mansion of 16 rooms with wraparound galleries. But the true engine of the plantation lay below, 2 long rows of quarters, the mill, the smokehouse, the cotton gin, and the disciplinary system that kept every cog turning. Colonel Radcliffe ran the estate with mathematical rigor, documenting every harvested bushel, every labor hour, every administered punishment. Jacob Terrell arrived at Radcliffe Plantation in the fall of 1852. He'd been purchased at a Richmond auction for the astonishing price of $2,050, almost triple the average. The auction records, still preserved in Virginia archives, list him as approximately 28 years old, 6 feet 7 inches tall, 260 pounds, an exceptional physical specimen, formerly employed in iron foundry labor and heavy timber work, and with no known history of resistance. What the documents omitted was this: Jacob had spent nearly his entire life in industrial labor, not agricultural work. Born on an iron plantation in the Shenandoah Valley, he'd worked furnaces and forges since age 12, developing not the wiry stamina of field workers, but the dense, compact strength of men who hauled ore and hammered steel for a living. His previous owner, a furnace master named Hiram Lowe, sold him not for disobedience but for financial survival. The Panic of 1851 had throttled Virginia's iron industry, forcing operations to liquidate assets. Colonel Radcliffe purchased Jacob specifically for the most grueling physical tasks: clearing new acreage, running the cotton press, and moving the heaviest equipment on the property. For nearly 4 years, Jacob carried out those duties without incident. He spoke little, worked efficiently, and drew no particular interest from overseers or other enslaved people. But something shifted in the winter of 1855. Martha Clements, the plantation's head cook and one of the few enslaved people permitted regular access to the main house, later told her granddaughter about it. That granddaughter preserved the story in a WPA interview in 1937. According to Martha, Jacob received news that autumn, a letter. How it reached him remains unknown. Enslaved people were forbidden to receive mail. The letter's contents were never confirmed, but Martha remembered seeing Jacob standing motionless behind the cookhouse one October evening, a slip of paper in his hand, his expression like a man who has just realized he's already dead. After that, Subtle changes took root. Jacob worked with the same cold efficiency as always, but overseers reported something unsettling beneath the surface, a mechanical obedience, as if he were counting down to something rather than complying. Thomas Gibbard, the head overseer, noted in his daily journal that Jacob had begun asking odd, practical questions about property lines, river depths, and the distances between neighboring counties. Nothing openly alarming, but enough to heighten scrutiny. The enslaved community felt it too. Some began avoiding him. Others gravitated toward him during evening gatherings, seeking a sense of safety they couldn't explain. Old Samuel, who had lived on Radcliffe land longer than any man alive, told Martha that Jacob reminded him of something he'd once seen before a violent storm, the strange stillness before the sky turns green and the tornado drops. Colonel Radcliffe, despite his famed attention to detail, noticed none of this. His focus that winter was fixed on his eldest daughter Caroline's upcoming marriage to a Charleston merchant, a union that would greatly strengthen his commercial ties. The wedding was set for late March 1856, with guests arriving from across the South. The estate needed to appear magnificent. In February, the colonel ordered an expansion of the cotton press yard, requiring more cleared land and new machinery. Jacob was placed in charge of the heavy labor, working alongside 8 other men under the supervision of 3 overseers: Gibbard, a Kentucky man named Elias Strauss, and a recent hire from Georgia, William Pritchard. The work moved forward steadily through February and into early March. But on March 14th, exactly 1 week before Caroline Radcliffe's wedding, everything changed. The morning of March 14th, 1856 began without a hint of what was coming. Dawn broke under a dense fog from the Tallapoosa River, one of those heavy gray veils that made the plantation feel suspended between worlds. Shapes and muffled sounds drifted through the thick morning mist. The temperature hovered near 40 degrees, cold enough that every breath emerged in pale clouds, but not cold enough to halt the day's work. As always, the plantation bell rang at 5:30 a.m., summoning everyone to their posts. Jacob reported to the cotton press yard as assigned, joining the labor crew, preparing timber for the new press foundation. Thomas Gibbard was already there, along with Eli Strauss and William Pritchard. The 3 overseers carried their usual instruments, coiled leather straps, hickory bats, and Gibbard's pistol displayed prominently on his belt. According to multiple testimonies collected afterward, the trouble began around 7:15 a.m., though accounts differ on what exactly sparked it. Gibbard's official report claimed Jacob refused a direct order to move a support beam and displayed open insolence. Eli Strauss wrote in his statement that Jacob had spoken disrespectfully after being corrected for slow work. But Martha Clements, drawing water from the well nearby, later told her granddaughter something far different. She said she heard Gibbard announce that a letter addressed to Jacob had been intercepted, that its sender had been handled according to law, and that Jacob needed to understand the consequences of unauthorized correspondence. Whatever the real trigger, what followed was witnessed by at least a dozen people and recorded in incident reports so disturbing that Colonel Radcliffe initially refused to submit them to county authorities. Gibbard approached Jacob with the leather strap, standard procedure even for minor infractions. Jacob, who had never before resisted punishment, didn't move. Gibbard ordered him to prepare himself. Jacob remained perfectly still, his gaze fixed on something in the distance, toward the river, though from that spot the river couldn't be seen through fog. Gibbard struck him hard across the shoulders. Jacob didn't flinch. Eli Strauss stepped in to assist, grabbing Jacob's arm to force him into position. What happened next confused everyone who saw it. Strauss later testified that Jacob's arm felt like grabbing a fence post, solid, unyielding. Jacob didn't jerk away, didn't brace, didn't fight. He simply stood immovable, as if the normal mechanics of leverage no longer applied. Pritchard joined in. 3 grown overseers, large men accustomed to force, attempted to move one man who wasn't even resisting, only standing still. And they failed completely. Gibbard, his authority slipping in front of the entire work crew, fired his pistol into the air and shouted for reinforcements. The gunshot brought 4 more overseers running. By now the fog was lifting, revealing the scene to an expanding crowd of enslaved workers who had stopped their tasks to watch. 7 overseers surrounded Jacob. Gibbard gave a clear command: restrain him and deliver punishment for insubordination. The men closed in at once. What unfolded over the next several minutes would be described with remarkable consistency by everyone who witnessed it, though none could explain it. The overseers tried to force Jacob to the ground using standard techniques they'd used for years: joint pressure, weight, coordinated leverage, overwhelming numbers. Jacob didn't resist in any ordinary way. He didn't swing, kick, grab, or push. He simply would not go down. Witnesses said it looked like men trying to topple a tree that had decided not to fall. Techniques that always worked. Techniques designed to overpower a human body. Produced nothing. Jacob's knees didn't buckle. His stance didn't break. His arms, even when gripped by multiple men, wouldn't bend into submission holds. By now the fog had completely burned away. The confrontation played out in full daylight before dozens of onlookers. Gibbard, now near panic, sent a runner to gather every remaining overseer on the plantation. Within 10 minutes, 12 men had assembled, the largest single gathering of armed authority most enslaved people on Radcliffe land had ever seen. 12 overseers against one unarmed man who still had not thrown a single blow. Colonel Radcliffe himself had been summoned and was approaching from the main house, his expression thunderous at such a disruption occurring so close to his daughter's wedding. The overseers coordinated their approach. This had ceased to be a punishment. It had become an assertion of the hierarchy that kept the entire plantation system intact. If one man could withstand 12, the structure itself was in danger. They rushed him from every direction. The sounds that followed, this detail appears in every written record, were wrong. Not the sound of a fight, but of collisions, bodies hitting earth with blunt, shocking force. Bone against bone, grunts of pain and gasps of surprise. But all those sounds came from the overseers, not from Jacob. When Colonel Radcliffe arrived, for overseers were already on the ground. Gibbard's shoulder was visibly dislocated. Eli Strauss's jaw hung at an unnatural angle. William Pritchard lay unconscious with a deep cut on his forehead. A 4th man struggled to breathe through broken ribs. The remaining 8 overseers had backed away, forming a loose circle around Jacob, who stood in the center, breathing heavily but otherwise untouched. One crucial detail appeared in every account. Jacob had not thrown a single punch. All the injuries had come from the overseer's own momentum, force redirected, bodies colliding with each other, failed takedowns that ended with them crashing into the ground. Several witnesses described it as watching men injure themselves against a wall that somehow anticipated their movements. Colonel Radcliffe drew his pistol. Silence dropped over clearing. Witnesses estimated the pause lasted 30 seconds, though fear distorts time. Jacob and the colonel stared at one another. In that prolonged stillness, something unspoken yet unmistakable passed between them. Radcliffe's finger hovered on the trigger. Jacob remained motionless, his expression unreadable. Then he spoke. His voice carried clearly across the clearing. All witnesses agreed on the words, though they differed on the tone. Some said it was hollow. Others said it was filled with sorrow. A few thought it sounded like pity. "I ain't here no more," Jacob said. You might be looking at me," Jacob said, "but I ain't here. I've been gone since that letter reached me." He turned then, not quickly, not in panic, but with a kind of calm finality, and began walking toward the tree line. Colonel Radcliffe shouted for the overseers to stop him, but not a single man moved. They watched, frozen in place, as Jacob disappeared into woods that bordered the northeastern edge of the plantation. The fog had fully burned away by then. The morning was bright and coldly clear, and Jacob Terrell, the man 12 armed overseers had failed to restrain, was simply gone. The immediate aftermath dissolved into a confusion bordering on hysteria. Colonel Radcliffe ordered a full lockdown of the plantation. No one was permitted to leave their assigned quarters or work areas. The 12 overseers, despite their injuries, were dispatched in pairs to comb the woods and the neighboring properties. Riders were sent to nearby estates with warnings and descriptions. The Madison County Sheriff was contacted, and within hours a formal manhunt had been assembled. 23 men and tracking dogs borrowed from a plantation 15 miles south. But Jacob Terrell had vanished with thoroughness that seemed impossible. The dogs found his scent easily near the cotton press clearing, followed the trail half a mile into the woods, and then lost it abruptly at the edge of a narrow creek. That in itself wasn't strange. Water often broke scent trails. What puzzled the trackers was that the dogs couldn't regain the trail on either bank. They searched 3 miles upstream and down. Nothing. It was as though Jacob had stepped into the creek and simply ceased to exist. The search lasted 11 days. Patrols examined every known hiding spot, every cave, every collapsed outbuilding within a 20-mile radius. They questioned enslaved people on adjoining plantations, offering rewards for information. They monitored road crossings, river fords, and known escape routes toward free states. They found nothing. During those 11 days, the atmosphere at Radcliffe Plantation transformed into something tense and brittle. The enslaved community, many of whom had witnessed the confrontation, maintained absolute silence when questioned by patrollers or sheriff's deputies. But among themselves, according to accounts preserved decades later, they spoke only about Jacob. Some believed he'd reached freedom. Others feared the punishment that would come when he was inevitably found. A few whispered that Jacob had never intended to run at all, that he'd walked into the woods to die on his own terms, after finally breaking under a weight he had carried too long. The wedding took place on March 21st as planned, though guests noted Colonel Radcliffe's distracted and rigid demeanor. 3 injured overseers were absent, unable to leave their beds. Servants later said the celebration felt unnatural, as if everyone was pretending not to feel the question hanging over the estate. How had one man resisted 12? And what did it mean that he had succeeded? Thomas Gibbard, his shoulder bound tightly after the dislocation, submitted his resignation on March 23rd. In his letter, still preserved in the plantation's papers, he wrote, "I can no longer in good conscience enforce discipline on this property. What I saw on March 14th has made me believe that the very structure of our system contains flaws I never recognized before. I respectfully request release from my duties." Eli Strauss resigned 2 days later. His letter was shorter. "I cannot explain what happened. I will not try. I'm returning to Kentucky." William Pritchard, who'd been unconscious during most of the critical moments, remained employed but began drinking heavily. Other enslaved workers reported seeing him stand for long stretches near the cotton press area, staring into the woods where Jacob had vanished, his face hollow with something close to fear. Colonel Radcliffe initially refused to discuss the incident at all. When pressed by county officials, he submitted only a sparse, sanitized report describing Jacob as an escaped slave who had shown unusual resistance to lawful restraint. He made no mention of the 12 overseers, their injuries, or the bizarre mechanics of the confrontation. The report listed Jacob's physical description, estimated value, and offered standard $50 reward. But privately, the colonel began investigating obsessively. He questioned every person who had known Jacob, searching for a clue he had missed. He reviewed purchase records, monthly logs, any scrap of documentation that might explain how a man described as compliant had transformed into someone capable of what happened on March 14th. His inquiries soon led him to the letter, the correspondence Martha Clemens had mentioned, the one Gibbard had reportedly referred to during the confrontation. He discovered that the plantation's mail inspector had indeed intercepted a letter addressed to Jacob in February. It had been confiscated and, according to procedure, was supposed to be destroyed immediately. But the colonel's review of the mail logs revealed something troubling. The letter had not been destroyed at once. One overseer, Henry Wallace, who'd resigned abruptly in January, had kept it for several days before turning it in. During that time, Wallace had apparently shown it to at least 3 other overseers. One of them had likely mentioned it to Jacob. either out of cruelty or arrogance, or simply provoke him. In early April, Colonel Radcliffe tracked Wallace down in Huntsville, where he was working as a supervisor in a textile mill. Wallace resisted discussing the matter. When pressed, he finally admitted the letter had come from Virginia, from a woman identifying herself as Jacob's wife. The letter, he said, had been short and devastating. Jacob's wife had been sold south after her owner's death. From a plantation somewhere in Georgia, she had managed to send word of her location. She begged Jacob not to come for her, acknowledged they would likely never see each other again, and revealed the final blow. She was pregnant with their child, conceived during Jacob's last visit before his own sale. Wallace said the ending lines had stayed with him. Don't let them take you piece by piece. Whatever they do to the body don't matter if you keep yourself whole inside. Remember me. Remember we real. The colonel asked Wallace why he had resigned so abruptly. Wallace's answer, recorded in the colonel's private journal, unsettled him deeply. After I read that letter, Wallace said, I couldn't look at any of them the same. I kept thinking about what it means to own a man who loves somebody. It started keeping me awake. Armed with this information, Colonel Radcliffe began reevaluating everything about the events of March 14th. Jacob's resistance hadn't been mindless rebellion or sudden madness. It had been a deliberate act, a decision made by a man who had just lost the last pieces of his world that made obedience bearable. The words I ain't here no more took on a new, chilling clarity. Jacob had severed himself psychologically from the circumstances of his enslavement. Physical coercion no longer worked on a man who no longer valued his own physical survival. That realization disturbed the colonel more than the escape itself. The system he'd maintained so meticulously relied on enslaved having something to lose. Relationships, small comforts, the hope of better treatment. A man who had abandoned all hope, who no longer feared pain or death, could not be controlled at all. On April 12th, nearly a month after the confrontation, a field hand discovered something near the northeastern boundary, close to where Jacob had vanished into the woods. Tucked into the hollow of an old oak tree, wrapped carefully in a cloth bundle, were 3 items: a small wooden carving of 2 figures holding hands, simple but lovingly crafted, a scrap of paper with Georgia address written in neat letters, and a thin metal tag from an iron foundry, the kind worn by skilled industrial workers. But what disturbed the colonel wasn't the contents. It was a note tucked alongside them, scrawled on a ragged piece of paper torn from what appeared to be the intercepted letter. The handwriting, though crude, was unmistakably Jacob's. I ain't running. I'm walking slow and steady. I'm going to Georgia. Might take me 4 months if I move careful. If I make it, you won't never hear from me again. If I don't, at least I died trying to get back to what matters. That morning at the press, I wasn't fighting nobody. I was showing y'all I ain't something you can move around no more. I'm a man deciding where he goes. You can kill a man like that, but you can't work him. Colonel, if you're reading this, know I ain't got no hate for you. You built your life on top of a lie you was told was true. I feel sorry for you having to live with that. The Rayall curse ain't on us. It's on y'all. You the ones who wake up every day knowing what you're doing ain't right and doing it anyway. That eats a man worse than any whip. The note bore no signature, but the handwriting matched the documents where Jacob marked his distinctive X. Colonel Radcliffe ordered the note destroyed and the bundle burned, but the contents spread anyway, whispered through the quarters, then through the overseer's ranks. The idea that Jacob hadn't fought them, that it had simply shown them they could no longer force him, left several overseers shaken. As spring turned to summer, the colonel made a decision. He quietly ended the search for Jacob. Publicly, the explanation was simple. After 2 months, recovery was unlikely and not worth further cost. But privately, Radcliffe admitted to his brother-in-law that he hoped Jacob had died in the woods or been killed attempting to reach Georgia, because the alternative frightened him more. The alternative meant Jacob had crossed 350 miles of hostile territory through planning, willpower, and absolute determination. It meant the mechanisms of control could be overcome. It meant obedience was always a choice. By autumn, life on the plantation had resumed its routines, though something beneath the surface had changed. The colonel hired 2 additional overseers, bringing the total to 19, but both resigned within months, describing an atmosphere they could not articulate but could not endure. Several enslaved people who had witnessed the March confrontation gained reputations for a new kind of quiet resistance, not open defiance, but calculated minimalism, a withdrawal of spirit that felt eerily familiar. William Pritchard's drinking worsened until Radcliffe dismissed him in November. Before leaving, Pritchard said something to Martha Clements she would remember for the rest of her life. "I keep dreaming about that morning. Not about Jacob walking off, about the moment before we rushed him, the way he looked at us, like he was already somewhere else, like we were the ones who weren't real anymore." Then, in January 1857, 9 months after Jacob disappeared, a letter arrived at Radcliffe Plantation. It bore a Georgia postmark and was addressed to the owner of Radcliffe Estate, Madison County, Alabama. The colonel recognized the handwriting immediately. It matched the note from the tree hollow, and it bore Jacob's signature mark. A simple X with a circle at the center, the mark he had developed at the ironworks to distinguish his name from others who couldn't write. The colonel let the envelope sit unopened on his desk for 3 days. When he finally broke the seal on January 19, 1857, the letter inside was brief. "Colonel Radcliffe, I made it. Took me till October, but I made it. I am writing to tell you 3 things. First, I ain't your property no more, and I ain't running. I am with my wife and my boy who was born in August. We are together, and that is all I wanted. Second, I want you to know I held no anger that morning in March. You did what you thought was right based on what you was taught, but that don't make it right. Third, I'm sending this so you understand something important. Every person you think you own is making the same choice I made every day. They choosing to stay, or choosing they ain't strong enough yet to leave, or choosing they got reasons they ain't ready to let go of. But they are choosing. You don't own nobody, Colonel. You just got a system that makes it hard for people to choose different. But hard ain't the same as impossible. I prove that. This letter is my way of saying that everything you think is solid ain't solid at all. I hope you think about that. I hope it bothers you." The letter ended without a signature other than the familiar X and circle mark. Those who saw the colonel reading it later recalled that his hands were trembling when he set it down. He immediately summoned Thomas Gibbard, who had reluctantly returned to the plantation in November after failing to secure work elsewhere. Radcliffe handed him the letter and asked one question. "Is this real? Could he actually have made it?" Gibbard read the letter slowly, jaw tight. 350 miles, he said at last, through Mississippi and Alabama and into Georgia, avoiding patrols, slave catchers, river crossings, winter clothes in, no supplies, no maps. It shouldn't be possible. The colonel pressed him. But Jacob Terrell did things that shouldn't have been possible on March 14th, Gibbard replied quietly. Maybe impossible ain't what we thought. Radcliffe sent an inquiry to the Georgia plantation whose address had been included in Jacob's bundle. 6 weeks later, the response arrived. Yes, a woman matching the description had indeed been there. Yes, she delivered a child in August. And yes, she had escaped in late October with the infant, vanishing with the same eerie completeness as Jacob. The Georgia overseer added one more detail. The night before her disappearance, one of our patrols reported seeing an unusually large man near the northern boundary. When they approached, he retreated into the woods. They pursued but lost him quickly, which seemed odd given the clear moonlight. The next morning, the woman and child were gone. We assumed the man was a hired freedman helping her escape. But after receiving your inquiry, I wonder if we witnessed something else entirely. That news spread through Radcliffe Plantation like wildfire, no matter how hard the colonel tried to contain it. The enslaved community received it with a mix of joy, fear, and something else, something subtle and dangerous. Overseers noticed a shift in posture, in the way people walked, the slight lift of chins, the quiet confidence returning to shoulders that had lived hunched for years. Martha Clements later described it simply. After word went round about Jacob and his wife, folks started walking different, not loud different, quiet different, like they remembered something they forgot. The colonel responded with tightening restrictions, night patrols, more cabin inspections, stricter movement rules, a ban on gatherings larger than 4. He hired 3 additional overseers just to patrol the boundaries after dark. But the crackdown had the opposite effect. Instead of restoring order, it increased resentment and fueled quiet resolve. More people began weighing the same calculation Jacob had made, what they could endure versus what they could try. In April 1857, 2 more people escaped Radcliffe Plantation. Neither was caught. The colonel blamed lax supervision and fired an overseer. In June, 3 more disappeared in a single night, leaving no sign behind. This was not normal. Runaways happened everywhere, but successful escapes where people simply vanished were rare. 6 disappearances in 3 months, all as complete as Jacob's, suggested something coordinated, something the colonel couldn't understand or stop. In July, Gibber approached him with a troubling observation. He had mapped the escape dates against moon phases and noticed a pattern. Every escape had occurred during a new moon, when darkness was absolute, and every person who'd escaped had been present during Jacob's confrontation with the overseers. They saw something that day, Gibber told him. Jacob ain't here no more, but what he did is still here. People saw what was possible, and now they can't unsee it. Desperate to regain control, the colonel made a decision he would regret for years. He ordered a public punishment of a man he suspected of coordinating the escapes, a worker named Daniel Hayes, a friend of several who had disappeared. The punishment was designed to send a clear message: 30 lashes administered before the entire enslaved community. The whipping was scheduled for July 28, 1857. But something happened that no one expected. As Daniel Hayes was tied to the post and the overseer raised a whip, a woman stepped forward. Then another, then a man. Within half a minute, more than 50 people had moved, forming a silent wall between Hayes and the overseer. They didn't shout or threaten. They simply stood there, a human barrier that could not be crossed without spilling the kind of blood that would ignite a riot. The overseer looked at the colonel. Radcliffe had gone pale. He ordered the crowd to disperse. No one moved. 5 minutes passed, timed by multiple witnesses. 5 minutes of absolute stillness. 2 groups facing each other, neither willing to back down, both knowing what the first swing of violence would mean. Then, from the center of the gathered workers, someone began humming. A simple tune, slow, steady, a familiar rhythm from work songs. Within seconds, others joined. Not loud, not defiant, just a soft, rising hum that filled the clearing with a sound somehow more unnerving than shouting could ever have been. Recognizing that force would escalate into catastrophe, the colonel did something he almost never did. He conceded. He ordered Daniel Hayes released and postponed the punishment, pending further review. As the crowd slowly dispersed, Radcliffe noticed something that chilled him more than the confrontation itself. Several of them were smiling, not openly, not mockingly, just small, private smiles of quiet satisfaction. They had demonstrated the very same principle Jacob had shown on March 14th. Unified, motionless resistance, even from unarmed people, could create a situation that raw force couldn't easily solve. And the effect of that moment rippled through Harrington Plantation all summer, reshaping it into something unrecognizable compared to a world that had been just 15 months earlier. Trying to maintain control, Colonel Radcliffe swung erratically between harsh crackdowns and uneasy concessions, creating an atmosphere of tension so unpredictable that it left everyone, enslaved and overseers alike, deeply unsettled. Between August and October, 4 more overseers resigned. Their letters cited nearly identical reasons: an inability to maintain discipline through traditional means, a sense that the plantation's very structure had shifted beneath their feet, and, most revealing, a growing discomfort with their own participation in the system. One overseer, Patrick Doyle from South Carolina, phrased it bluntly in his resignation: "I came here believing I understood this business. The past year proved I understood nothing. When 50 people can stop a lawful punishment by standing still, when 6 can vanish as though the earth swallowed them, when one man's act of resistance can alter how hundreds think about their situation, then this whole operation rests on foundations more fragile than any of us admitted. I no longer believe those foundations can hold, and I don't wish to be here when they fail." Meanwhile, within the enslaved community, a transformation of equal magnitude was unfolding. The solidarity shown during the Daniel Hayes incident had been powerful, but also perilous. Everyone involved understood that the colonel had backed down not because he was persuaded, but because he feared escalation. And everyone understood he would eventually attempt to reassert control in ways that didn't involve public humiliation. He began implementing subtler tactics. He separated close friends, assigning them to different work crews. He trimmed rations, not enough to be obvious punishment, but enough to create a constant, grinding discomfort. He added locks to the smokehouse, the mill, the tool sheds, any space where people might talk unobserved. He quietly recruited informants, offering small privileges to anyone willing to report signs of organized resistance. These strategies created fractures within the quarters. Some individuals, terrified of the rising tension, withdrew from anything that might seem rebellious. Others doubled down on quiet defiance, developing coded communication and patterns that couldn't be traced to any one person. Martha Clements, moving daily between the main house and the quarters, observed both sides. She watched the colonel's unease grow, saw him poring over patrol logs, noticed how easily loud noises startled him now. She also saw the evening gatherings in the quarters, where messages were shared through work songs whose meanings overseers couldn't decipher. Then, in September, another letter arrived from Georgia, marked with Jacob's distinctive symbol. It was even shorter than the previous one. "Colonel Radcliffe, you writing to plantations looking for me. You won't find me. I ain't where I was. We moved north. I won't say where. But I heard about Daniel Hayes. Heard about 50 people standing together. That ain't because of me. That's people deciding what they will and won't accept. I just showed them they could decide. What comes next is on them, and on you, you still got choices. You can try to hold tighter. That won't work, and you know it. Or you can recognize the whole system you defend is already crumbling. You're just too close to see it yet. I don't expect you to free nobody. I don't expect you to forget what you've been taught. I just expect you to understand this. Everything happened at your place this year is going to keep happening everywhere. People ain't accept their things no more. And no overseers, locks, or punishments can stop it because the thing that changed ain't outside. It's inside. And you can't reach that. Good luck, Colonel. You're going to need it." When the colonel finished reading, witnesses later claimed he laughed. Not in amusement, but in a kind of rattled despair wearing the mask of bitter humor. He hid the letter, showed it to no one, yet it clearly affected him. He began spending hours alone in his study, combing through decades of plantation records as if searching for the precise moment the shift had begun. He questioned overseers about discipline techniques. He visited neighboring plantations, seeking advice on maintaining order in what he now called changing circumstances. What he found disturbed him even more. Other plantations were experiencing similar patterns, not as dramatic as Radcliffe's, but noticeable. More escapes, more subtle resistance, more disruptions that couldn't be neatly explained. Most planters blamed abolitionist influence, insisting Northern propaganda had infected the minds of enslaved people. But Radcliffe sensed something else entirely. He kept returning to one line in Jacob's letter: "You can't work a man who decided he ain't a thing no more." The problem wasn't external agitation. It was internal transformation. People reaching quiet breaking points where obedience became psychologically impossible regardless of consequences. And if that was true, then no amount of surveillance or force could fix it. Because the danger wasn't outside, it was within the very people the system required stripping of their humanity. This realization terrified the Colonel more than anything Jacob had physically done. He began to understand that Jacob Terrell hadn't won through brute strength or clever escape planning. He had won by choosing, fully, absolutely, to believe he was a human being with the right to determine his own life. And once someone believed that, no power on the plantation could unmake it, then acting on that decision with absolute commitment. And because hundreds of people had witnessed it, that decision took root in their minds like a seed that could no longer be pulled out. If Jacob could choose, so could they. In November 1857, Colonel Radcliffe made an extraordinary decision. He sold 75 people, nearly a third of Harrington's enslaved population, to plantations scattered across 3 different states. He publicly claimed he was liquidating excess assets because of fluctuations in the cotton market. But everyone understood the truth. He was dismantling the community that had seen Jacob resist 12 overseers and walk away. The sales were targeted with cold precision. Families were torn apart. Close friends separated. Individuals sent hundreds of miles in different directions with no familiar faces waiting for them. His goal was to scatter the memory of what happened to Harrington, break it apart, dilute it, bury it. But memories don't need proximity to survive. They travel in whispers, in work songs, in letters that slip through cracks in the system, in new arrivals at distant plantations repeating stories they carried from Alabama. And Jacob's story, reshaped, retold, amplified, became larger than the man himself. It became a parable, a moment in which a person decided that existence without dignity was no longer acceptable. A story about a man who refused to be moved. And everywhere the soul people went, that story changed something small but vital in how others thought. Just when it seemed the worst had already passed, the events of Harrington Plantation in March 1856 began to echo far beyond Madison County. If this story is sending chills through you, share this video with someone who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss news stories like this. Now, let's uncover what became of both Jacob Terrell and Colonel Radcliffe in the months and years that followed. The winter of 1857 to 1858 brought a cold deep in Alabama had felt in decades. The Tennessee River froze thick enough in some spots for people to walk across, a rarity locals said they hadn't seen in 40 years. At Harrington Plantation, now running with a reduced, intentionally fractured population, the cold felt like a reflection of the atmosphere of suspicion and bitterness that had replaced the plantation's former brutal efficiency. Colonel Radcliffe had aged dramatically in the 18 months since Jacob's resistance. Neighbors commented on his graying hair, his unfocused stare, his obsessive fixation on security far out of proportion to any real threat. His daughter Caroline, now living in Charleston, visited for Christmas and was disturbed enough to write her husband. "Papa is not well, though he denies it. He speaks constantly of vigilance, jumps at small noises, and stays up late reviewing patrol reports. He reminds me of a general convinced the enemy has slipped past his lines but cannot identify where." What Caroline didn't know was that her father had been receiving letters, not from Jacob, who had stopped writing after September, but from overseers and owners across the South, some as far as Mississippi and South Carolina. They wanted details about the unusually strong man who had resisted multiple overseers. Despite the colonel's efforts to contain the story, it spread everywhere, through plantation networks, through slave quarters, even into a handful of abolitionist publications. Stories varied in detail, but the core remained. One man stood still while 12 could not move him. In February 1858, almost 2 years after Jacob walked into the woods, a visitor arrived unannounced. A Kentucky lawyer named Ambrose Stillwell, representing a client whose identity he refused to disclose. Stillwell carried a leather satchel and insisted on a private meeting. behind the closed doors of the colonel's study. Stillwell revealed the purpose of his visit. His client, protected by attorney-client privilege, wanted to purchase detailed information about Jacob, his background, his training, his physical capabilities, and the circumstances of his resistance and escape. The offer was staggering. $500 for what amounted to historical notes about a man who, legally, was still the colonel's property, though practically unrecoverable. When Radcliffe demanded to know why anyone would pay so much, Stillwell answered cautiously, "My client is interested in the limits of human capability under extreme psychological pressure. The incident on your plantation appears to be an unusual case study." The colonel immediately refused. He wanted no further documentation, no scholarly interest, no additional scrutiny of the events that had shattered his authority and unraveled his workforce. He ordered Stillwell off the property, but before leaving, Stillwell placed a bound packet on the colonel's desk. "You should read this," he said quietly. "It concerns the full scope of what you witnessed." Inside the packet was a compilation of incident reports from 8 plantations across 4 states, dates ranging from March 1856 to January 1858. Each described some form of organized resistance, work stoppages, mass refusals to accept punishment, coordinated escapes. And in each case, investigators had traced the spark of these movements back, through chains of people and stories, to either someone who had been a Harrington plantation or someone who had spoken with such a person. The pattern was unmistakable. Jacob Terrell's individual act of resistance had ignited collective resistance. The story of one man standing immovable while 12 overseers failed to force him down had become a catalyst, a narrative people used to reimagine what was possible. One report from Mississippi was especially striking. 23 people had simply stopped working in the middle of peak cotton-picking season, stood silently in the field, and refused every order to resume. When the overseer advanced with the whip, they closed ranks, forming a tight human circle. No threats, no blows, no attempt to flee, just an unmovable collective presence that made any punishment too dangerous to carry out. The standoff lasted 6 hours. Finally, the plantation owner conceded in open negotiations over working conditions, an almost unheard of response. The report noted that several of the individuals involved had been purchased months earlier from an Alabama state that had liquidated assets in November. Harrington Plantation. Colonel Radcliffe, reading these accumulated reports while sleet clattered against the study windows, felt something like an epiphany, though it was rooted not in understanding but in dread. Jacob Terrell hadn't merely escaped. He had demonstrated a principle that, once witnessed, once understood, could never be forgotten, that the system's power did not come from its inherent strength, but from the willingness of those it controlled to comply. And compliance, he now saw with devastating clarity, was always contingent, always fragile, always a choice that could, at any moment, be revoked. The entire machinery of plantation slavery was built on the assumption that overwhelming force, systemic isolation, and relentless degradation could create permanent submission. Jacob had proven that assumption false. Not through rebellion, not through bloodshed, but through a single, absolute refusal to participate in his own oppression. And hundreds of people had witnessed that refusal. Hundreds who could never unsee it. The colonel understood now that selling away those witnesses had been the worst possible response. Instead of containing the event, he had scattered it like seed grain. Every person he'd sold had carried the story outward, planting it in new soil. In April 1858, the colonel made a decision that stunned his family and neighbors. He began arrangements to sell Harrington Plantation entirely. The official explanation was retirement, exhaustion, and age. He was approaching 60, after all. But those who knew him suspected the truth. He could no longer maintain the psychological illusions required to operate a plantation. He had seen too clearly the truth beneath its foundations, how fragile it all was, how dependent on voluntary compliance, how permeable the barriers were that he once believed absolute. The sale was finalized in September 1858. The new owner, a mobile merchant with no plantation experience. Paid a sum that reflected land, buildings, and equipment, but not the diminished workforce or the place's tarnished reputation. Within 2 years, that owner also sold. He too discovered that running a plantation where every worker had heard stories about a man who could not be moved was nearly impossible. But what became of Jacob Terrell himself? Here the historical record grows thin, mixed with unverified testimony and myth that accumulated around his name. Still, a few pieces can be stated with some confidence. In the summer of 1860, a Philadelphia abolitionist newspaper published an anonymous account by someone signing himself only as J.S., described as formerly enslaved in Virginia and Alabama. The account told a successful escape, a grueling journey of roughly 350 miles, and a reunion with family that restored, in his words, "the part of my humanity a lifetime of bondage had tried to take." One passage bore uncanny resemblance to the Harrington incident. "I learned that day that true resistance is not violence and not flight. It is the absolute insistence on your own dignity in a place built to destroy it. I did not fight those 12 men. I simply decided they no longer had the authority to define who I was or where I would go. And once a man decides that with his whole being, everything changes." Whether J.S. was Jacob Terrell can't be proven, but the Philadelphia Quaker community that published the account was known to help escaped slaves, especially those who had shown extraordinary resolve, like the resolve Jacob would have needed to complete his journey. There are no records of Jacob's death, no reports of recapture, no confirmed sightings. For a man once considered valuable property whose disappearance had sent shockwaves through the region, this silence is remarkable. It suggests either that he successfully vanished into northern free black communities, or that he died somewhere on the way and was never identified. But in truth, Jacob's final fate matters less than what he'd already accomplished. On March 14th, 1856, Jacob Terrell had exposed the lie at the heart of the slave system. He proved that power depended entirely on the consent of the oppressed. He demonstrated human dignity so unmistakable that it rewrote the way hundreds of people understood their own agency. He showed that the enslaved were not passive objects of control, but people making choices every day, choices to endure or resist. 3 years later, the nation erupted into the Civil War, a conflict fought over economics, state sovereignty, ideological divisions, but at its core, over the question Jacob had already illuminated. Could a system built on denying the humanity of millions survive once those millions insisted on their humanity? The next 4 years wrote the answer in blood. No, Colonel Marcus Radcliffe lived until 1871. He survived the war, emancipation, and Reconstruction, but never recovered from what he had witnessed in March 1856. His later letters reveal a man ravaged by guilt, grappling with truths he had spent a lifetime refusing to see. In an 1869 letter to his daughter Caroline, he wrote, "I was not a cruel man, Caroline, yet I took part in a cruelty so complete that any individual kindness I offered became meaningless. That man Terrell taught me this, not through his words, but through what he showed. He revealed that every person I claimed to own had been choosing each day to endure, and that this choice, this dignity, survived despite all I had done to erase it. Harrington Plantation changed owners twice more. Before being subdivided into smaller farms in the 1880s, Harrington Plantation passed through multiple owners. The cotton press clearing where Jacob had made his stand was eventually overtaken by weeds, later cleared again for other uses. Today, nothing physical remains to mark the spot where that confrontation unfolded, but the story endured. In the decades after the Civil War, as formerly enslaved people began sharing their experiences, multiple WPA interviews and personal recollections mentioned the man 12 overseers couldn't move. The tale had traveled through slave quarters across the South, always keeping its core intact. His massive size, his calmness, the fact that he never struck a blow, his walk into the woods while armed men froze, and especially his words, "I ain't here no more." Martha Clements, who lived until 1938, told her granddaughter that the moment Jacob stood unmoved was The first time I ever saw white folks not know what to do. She said it changed something deep inside everyone who saw it or heard about it. Not that we all thought we could do what Jacob did, she explained. Most of us couldn't, and most of us had reasons we couldn't leave even if we was able. But we started understanding their power over us wasn't magic or natural or from God. It was just their power, and it only worked because we went along with it. Jacob showed us we was go along, that we was choosing it even if every choice was bad. That knowledge don't set you free by itself, but you can't get free without it. The question of whether Jacob possessed extraordinary physical strength or whether his resistance was something else, an overwhelming psychological resolve that appeared like physical invulnerability, can never be answered definitively. Multiple witnesses confirmed the overseer's inability to restrain him. By witness accounts under fear and chaos are famously unreliable. Historically, what matters is not whether Jacob was objectively stronger than other men. What matters is that his act revealed a truth about power, compliance, and human agency that reverberated far beyond one plantation in Alabama. American slavery, in hindsight, carried the seeds of its own destruction from the beginning. It required the constant participation of those it enslaved. This meant the system depended entirely on ongoing decisions, conscious or unconscious, to comply rather than resist. As long as the consequences of resistance remained unthinkably severe, compliance held. But once enough people, whether inspired by stories like Jacob's or pushed their own breaking points, decided that survival within the system was itself unbearable, no amount of force could maintain control. Jacob Terrell didn't end slavery. He didn't even meaningfully weaken it. But he added another story to the growing archive of resistance, the accumulating pressure that eventually made the entire system unsustainable. He proved, in a moment witnessed by hundreds, that the power to say no, even unarmed, even outnumbered, even facing overwhelming force, never completely disappears as long as someone is willing to accept the consequences. Whether Jacob lived to see emancipation, whether he raised his son in freedom, whether he ever knew how widely his story spread, we cannot know. The record falls silent after 1860, perhaps the best possible ending for an escaped man who wanted only anonymity and safety. Or perhaps the silence hides a darker fate shared by countless others. Capture, death, separation, loss. We will never know for certain. What we do know is this. On March 14, 1856, on a plantation in Madison County, Alabama, one man decided that his physical body mattered less than his psychological freedom. And by making that decision with complete conviction, he changed how hundreds of people understood their own lives. The story of that morning, 12 armed men unable to restrain one unarmed man who simply refused to be moved, became a parable about power, resistance, and a dignity that cannot be taken so long as a person refuses to surrender it. This mystery reminds us that the most powerful forms of resistance are not always violent revolts or daring escapes. Sometimes they are simple refusals, quiet yet unbreakable, made with such absolute certainty that they reveal the system's dependence on compliance. What do you think? Was Jacob Terrell uniquely strong, or was his resistance purely psychological? A determination so complete that it manifested as physical mobility? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this dark historical mystery and want more stories like it, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who finds power in forgotten moments that challenge America's most brutal systems. See you in the next video. And total approximately 58,000 characters.